Well, for more on Pence's speech and the state of the U.S. China relationship, I'm joined by Andrew Blasi, a director at Crowel Moring International. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Rachelle. Thank you.
So let's start with your reaction, your take on Vice President Mike Pence's speech this year compared to last year.
So I think the speech this year was very much as expected, right? I think it's very much one of those situations where the Vice President chose his words very, very carefully. Now, you asked, Rachelle, about how do we compare, right? This year's speech at the Woodrow Wilson Institute versus a year ago at the Hudson Institute. And I would say there are a couple of important similarities, let's call it that way. So first, we can see a similarity in terms of the Vice President made very clear that there's a litany of challenges that the United States has with China, and those range from economic issues to political issues. But another consistent theme that I would see across between the 2008 speech and the speech that was today was really the focus on the need for constructive dialogue and constructive engagement. So it was good to see that. In terms of what drives these sort of speeches apart, what are some unique nuances between the two? I thought it was quite interesting that we had a real focus on the need to get the economic relationship right in this speech, and how that then connects into the fundamental question of some of these other concerns that the Vice President was talking about. So really putting the need of that economic relationship first. And I think another important area of note was the real decided focus in his remarks today on the U.S. business community.
And there certainly was a mix of sort of praise, but we also heard him use the word rival. So as we're just a few weeks away from the upcoming APEC summit where the two leaders are expected to meet, do you think that helps or hurts in terms of the potential progress?
Yeah, I think the words here are really cautious optimism, right? I think the Vice President's speech today lays out a pretty clear tone about where the administration stands heading into sort of the APEC Leaders Summit in Chile, as you mentioned, and the expectation of a signing agreement of a Phase 1 arrangement there. But ultimately, uncertainty still abounds. And I think the administration is pretty resolved as it looks to some of the concerns that it has, and is hopeful, as I said, cautiously optimistic that we could look to see a Phase 1 deal next month.
And as you mentioned, with this Phase 1 deal, it was announced, obviously nothing signed at this point. What do we know about the sort of concessions that might be the deal breakers in whether or not Phase 1 does get signed?
Well, I think ultimately for the president and for the administration, they're very much thinking about the comments that the president made during, you might remember, his meeting with both his cabinet, Liu He, and the delegation. I think for the president, he's gone on record saying these are the commitments that have been made and the achievements that have been made during the course of the negotiation, and therefore that would be sort of the level set expectation on the part of the administration for a Phase 1 agreement. And that includes many of the items that you've long talked about, right? Agriculture, some initial touchings on intellectual property protection, some of the financial services issues, currency, etc.
And we know that there is this issue of whether or not to lift the tariffs, being that there's going to be a Phase 2 and a Phase 3. What do we know about what might be in the content or perhaps the timeline for these additional phases?
So for Phase 2, I think we can say it completely depends on Phase 1, right? That's where all the energy and focus is, because regardless of whether we have a signing of a Phase 1 arrangement at the APEC Economic Leaders meeting in Chile next month or not, Phase 2 is going to be much more difficult and highly uncertain. As we have been hearing, it deals with a number of these important structural issues, right, that go a lot deeper, shall we say, than the Phase 1 items. I would note, though, as you heard in today's speech by the Vice President, there is a real indication from the administration that they're already looking to a Phase 2 arrangement, looking to delve more deeply into those issues. I thought that was pretty pointed during the Vice President's Q&A session, so after the speech.
And obviously, the business community on both sides is watching what happens with this relationship. What sort of changes have both countries had to make to really adapt to the fallout from the tensions?
So, I mean, the biggest one, Rachelle, is really all about uncertainty, right? So we can talk about tariffs, we can talk about investment flows, we can talk about supply chains. I mean, if you're talking about the United States or China, pretty much every business in some way is affected. If you're, it doesn't matter even if you're a multinational company or a domestic enterprise in the United States. But it really all does come back to uncertainty, and I think that's really where business is generally focused across sectors, across industries. Now, in terms of impact, right now I think we can say that the trade war or trade negotiation impacts from the tariffs are fairly modest. I think we're only beginning to see what those implications could be. I'm of the view that the domestic political and economic environments within China and within the United States will be greater determinants of the impacts that industries face in terms of their performance and success, at least in the short term.
All right, thank you so much for joining us. Andrew Blasi there, Director at Crowel Moring International.